Hey everybody, and welcome to our lecture on reflecting skills and particularly paraphrasing. So this is the first time we're talking about reflecting skills, so we're going to talk about those kind of broadly, and then we'll narrow it down to paraphrasing. This should be a pretty short presentation, kind of short and sweet, but should be helpful in you're learning about reflecting skills in general, and then paraphrasing is kind of a subset of those. Okay, so reflecting, why do we do it? Reflecting is a technique and one of the kind of central techniques of any counseling process, and we do it because it is a means of communicating empathy. And so, when we talk about empathy being one of those foundational elements of a therapeutic relationship, it has to be there for the therapeutic relationship to be strong, for clients to feel understood. And so we really need to focus on and emphasize communicating empathy. And what reflecting does is it tells the client that we understand their situation based off of the information that they're giving us. And so reflecting is a way to take the parts of what a client is saying in front of us and how they're presenting and give them back to the client in a way that communicates that, like, this person gets it, right? They understand what I'm saying, what I'm going through, maybe what I'm not saying, and it can be a really powerful tool for that purpose. So it is kind of one of our primary techniques for communicating empathy, and one we want to do pretty regularly. It does stimulate exploration, and in particular, it stimulates exploration in a way that the client is in control of. And so if we are reflecting back to a client what they are communicating to us, either verbally or non-verbally, what that does is it challenges or invites the client to kind of sit with that reflection. So if we are reflecting a situation that they're telling us about, we're not asking questions about it. So we're not kind of directing the next point in the conversation by what we think should happen next. We are simply reflecting back what they have told us, so they know what we've heard, what they've said, and then they get to pick where to go. So it really does stimulate exploration in a way that questions just do not. And it can be a really helpful way to make sure that the client is the one driving the exploration based on their experience and what's most important to them. In that it does facilitate introspective depth, right? So it's meant to help the client become more self-aware, to think about at a deeper level what they're going through. And then it can confirm or correct the client's experience. So, sometimes we might reflect something to the client and we're not 100% sure it's accurate, and that's okay. We are reflecting it to kind of test the waters of, is this what they are saying? Is this what they're experiencing? Is this what they are feeling? Whatever type of reflection it might be. But we're using the reflection as a way to make an informed guess at what the client is experiencing. Is that kind of active empathizing process? Like, we're trying to understand their experience and we think this is what they are experiencing. But we're not 100% sure. So we're going to reflect it, and then we're going to let the client confirm or alter what we say to let us know if we're accurate or not. So in that way, it can kind of confirm or correct our empathetic understanding of the client. So when we're talking about trying to understand a client, we're going to look at this a couple different ways. I think the next slide is kind of a different version of the same idea. Generally speaking, when we're talking about depth of understanding and self-awareness, both for us and for the client, just for people in general, facts and thoughts are generally easy to access and understand. Meaning, you could ask pretty much anybody, kind of what they did today, and they would probably be able to tell you with some degree of accuracy and without a lot of vulnerability, for the most part, what they did today, right? I mean, it's pretty easy to access that information. Same with thoughts. Thoughts are relatively easy to access. They are, for the most part, they feel pretty safe to share. I mean, depending on the thought, but generally speaking, people are more comfortable sharing their thoughts maybe than they are their emotions. That's what this graph is meant to kind of represent. This idea that facts and thoughts are generally easier to access and they are safer to share. They feel safer to share than emotional experience. So emotional experience, we may not be as aware of it, and if we are aware of it, it may take a higher level of vulnerability to share with someone else than kind of factual things or our thought processes. And then hidden meanings is kind of the underlying pieces that we aren't always aware of, but if you think about how human beings navigate the world, we have to make meaning of a lot of things, a lot of situations. We have to try to figure out why things are happening the way they are happening. What does this mean to us? What does this mean to our lives? How do we adjust from there? There's this kind of underlying um, existential process that's always happening, right? That we are constantly making meaning in life and subscribing or prescribing meaning to different things based off of how things are unfolding and how we're experiencing the situation and how we're choosing to look at the situation and gain perspective and learn, or we make some intentional choices about meaning making, but sometimes those are happening at a very um, subconscious or unconscious level. Like we're not readily aware that that's how we're making meaning out of a situation, and so that is at a very deep level that is happening generally. And so this chart, this graph, is meant to represent that idea of things that are easy to access, safe to share, and then as you kind of go in, things that are a little more intimate, a little more vulnerable, and sometimes are not always readily in our awareness. So this is the graph I mentioned that's kind of similar. When we reflect, we can think about that graph in terms of at what level are we wanting to reflect, because we can reflect very intentionally to give a session direction, right? I mean, we can, for example, if a client tells us a story, right, and so like a play-by-play of an interaction or something that happened to them, and it's very kind of content or factually based, like here, this happened, and this happened, and this happened. We can choose to reflect that. We can stay at the content level and let them know we heard them, and we get what they're saying. We understand the situation from a kind of content or factual level. We could read into their thought process in that situation based off of how they're describing it. And so that would be kind of a level down. We could reflect the thought processes that were kind of embedded in that situation, even if they're not explicitly said. And that would take it to a different level, because now we're getting past like, here's just what happened. We're getting to, here's how you're thinking about what happened. And then if we wanted to go to kind of a deeper level of reflection, we could look for kind of embedded emotional experiences in that situation that the client described and reflect that back. So that's getting at an even deeper level of self-awareness and reflection for the client. Again, they may not have said explicitly how they were feeling in a situation, but part of the work of actively empathizing is understanding what it is they're saying, seeing how they are saying it, right? Picking up on those nonverbal cues, and then doing some active empathizing, using your imagination to say, okay, if I were this person, my client, in the situation that they are describing, I might feel this way. And then we can reflect that back. Again, we're kind of testing it. We don't know that it's 100% accurate, but if it is or if it's not, either way, we're going to raise their awareness about how were you feeling in this situation, right? And so they may say, yes, that is exactly it. I was feeling this way because of the situation. And if that is the case, if we're accurate in that kind of reflection, that's where that active empathizing is communicated accurately. That's where they they say, I hadn't thought about it, but this person gets what I feel like. Like I didn't articulate how I was feeling in that situation, but this counselor sitting across from me knows how I'm feeling, right? They get it. That's where the empathetic communication can be really powerful and help in the therapeutic relationship. It helps the client feel like we understand them. It also raises their awareness. And then, at the meaning level, it's the same kind of thing, right? If we're able to really understand the underlying processes of this is how this person is making sense of this situation in their life, then that can be a really powerful thing to reflect to a client and let them know that we understand and help raise their awareness around it. So we'll talk about each of these separately, right? Like moving forward in this presentation, we'll talk about content and thoughts primarily, and we kind of categorize that as paraphrasing. But in future weeks, we'll talk about reflecting emotions and reflecting a meaning. So we'll get into each of these and what they look like and how to go about doing it. So paraphrasing is kind of that top level of reflecting, and so it's a really good way to learn to reflect because you're not doing that much of that kind of inferring that I was talking about. You're not doing a whole lot of that active empathizing of the unsaid part of a client's experience. Here, you're really focusing on what the client is saying. And so to do that, you need to listen very carefully. So you're really paying attention to what a client is saying. You're trying to actively listen in a way that you're not thinking about responding. If you remember that from the previous presentation, that idea of like it's really hard to really listen carefully and actively and be thinking about what you're going to say next. That's a tricky thing to do at the same time. So we really want to focus on actively listening, just listen to listen and listen to understand. We do want to be non-judgmental, right? So we're not judging what a client is saying. We're just trying to understand it and then reflect it back as accurately as we can. And you can think about it as a condensed restatement of both factual things and thoughts. And so this is very much what a client is giving you, but you don't want to just be a parrot. Like you don't want to say back to the client everything they just told you. You're trying to kind of summarize things or just kind of get to the essence of them. And so a lot of times you will shorten what a client is saying and just get kind of the highlights of what they are saying. And in that, it's important to realize that what we are choosing to shorten, what we are choosing to focus on, is going to have an impact for the next step in the process, right? So if a client spends, I don't know, 5 minutes describing a situation at work or an encounter they had with a colleague or a boss or whatever, when we reflect, we're going to be picking specific parts of that encounter or experience that they just described to put back to the client. And those are the parts we pick are most likely what the client is going to reflect on and expand on and develop an awareness of. So we want to be intentional about what we are picking to reflect. And that's a process. It just takes practice. You've got to listen very carefully. Got to go through this process of thinking about what parts of that do I want to put back to the client, and then putting those back to the client, reflecting them in a way that's not just parroting what they said. All right, things we don't want to do. We do want to stay away from just kind of doing nothing but reciting facts. That there's just not that much reflective value in doing nothing but reflecting facts. You might do it every once in a while, but you don't want all your reflections, all your paraphrases to just be nothing but factual content kind of stuff, because that's just not going to, there's very little awareness that needs to be raised there because the client knows what happened, right? And so you don't want to get too heavy into the reciting facts. Things to avoid when paraphrasing: cognitive noise. This is our cognitive noise. This is what I was talking about in the last slide where yes, we're sitting in front of the person, we're listening, we're hearing what they're saying, but we're not really understanding with any kind of depth what they're saying because we are thinking about other things. We're thinking about our body posture. We're thinking about what we're going to say when they finish talking, like going ahead and forming our question or our reflection, which is, I think, a very natural thing to do, especially when you're learning to do these skills. But ultimately, we want to turn down as much of the cognitive noise as possible because it's hard to be present and have a lot of that cognitive noise happening at the same time. So yeah, thinking about what to say next is something we want to avoid doing. Side with the client. So I want to be clear here that empathizing is not the same as agreeing, right? You can understand someone's experience without necessarily agreeing with their experience. And so what we're not doing here is just kind of agreeing and siding with the client and saying, yes, you're right. What we're doing is saying, I get your experience. So that's I think a distinct, difference that we want to be intentional about, which is Communicating understanding is very different than communicating agreement. And turning it into a question. So paraphrasing is really easy to turn into a question, and all it takes is a little inflection at the end, right? It's the difference between me saying, you got in an argument with your boss yesterday. That's a reflection of content. And then I can say the same thing with an inflection at the end and turn it into a question. You got into an argument with your boss yesterday, right? Exact same words, but it's just that little at the end that turns it from a statement to a question. We want to be careful about that. All right, so some tips for paraphrasing. Stick with basic facts and disclosed intentions. So we're not wanting to get into kind of guessing someone's intent in a particular situation. Just go with what they say in terms of intent. If you get lost, repeat repeat the last thing a client said. I think this is a good tip, right? If your mind does wander, because it happens, we're human. Just repeat back what the last client said, right? It might be a bit of the parroting, but in the grand scheme of things, you're letting a client know you're listening. And so if you do get lost in everything a client's saying, go with the last thing because that's the freshest and we can just repeat it back. And it keeps the conversation going. And then, don't paraphrase too early. We do want to start a dialogue with a client in a way that we are inquisitive and we are giving a little structure to the conversation at the beginning. So paraphrases are generally used as we're getting into a conversation, right? As a kind of a natural flow. It should become a regular tool we're using to communicate empathy, let the client know we're listening, that we understand their experience. All right, y'all. That's it. I told you this would be a short one. So that is our introduction into reflecting as a general skill that we'll talk about, kind of subsets of that skill. And then paraphrasing, kind of the reflection of content and thought being one of the foundations of reflecting. So I hope that's helpful and look forward to practicing this when we get into class. All right, y'all. Bye.